Hi there, and welcome back to Agrc 102, Animal Nutrition. We transition to the back half of the course here where we will begin to apply the things that we've talked about in the first 5 units. Feeds, feeding, guidelines, nutrients, additives, and so forth to each particular species. And to begin that conversation, we're going to focus on swine here in Unit 6. This will be a 2-part lecture series with 2 rather short segments, hopefully. So let's get to our content here. Really briefly, you can review the objectives here, but the bottom line is we're going to discuss feeding the life cycle feeding program of pigs, talk about nutrient needs, potential feeds and additives, and a little bit on feed processing, feeding systems, etc. So let's get to it in more detail. So first things first, let's focus on the breeding herd and specifically to this slide, the boar. Protein requirements here are listed on the left, and just as you'll see through the rest of the slide deck here with pigs and pretty much for all species as we go along, crude protein concentrations are going to decline as that animal gets older. So the boars that we're potentially going to use in our breeding program from 50 to 125 pounds body weight are going to be up there in that 18% crude protein need. As they get to 125 to 200 pounds, kind of that mid-weight range, we're going to begin to drop that down to an 18% crude protein diet. And then mature boars over 200 pounds body weight, 14%, and if I were to put a range to it, would be in that 12 to 14% number. Probably most importantly in the middle part of the slide here is be responsive to body weight. And we haven't talked very specifically yet about body condition. But body condition is exceedingly important when we consider evaluation of rations and the appropriate body weight at the appropriate time. And it's no different with boars. And so we do not want to get boars too heavy because, number one, they produce less semen. And they're also harder on the sows and gilts if we're doing natural service. So we want to think about once we get up there approaching that 180 pounds body weight, we begin to dilute the ration energy density. And we can do that by adding fiber, whether it's things like alfalfa meal or soybean hulls or cottonseed hulls. But we want to dilute that carbohydrate density or potentially limit feed. So instead of allowing them to eat all they want, we only give them a measured amount of feed. There's also some differences in breeding versus non-breeding season. In the non-breeding season for mature boar, again, down in that 12 to 14% crude protein range, and really about 4 to 6 pounds of feed per day is about all they really need. So that would be a limit feeding type approach, or just simply making the ration much more energy diverse and less carbohydrate dense. Once you get begin to approach breeding season about 10 to 14 days prior, we want to start to increase the feed by about 50% and increase the energy density and get that body condition start to add a little bit. We don't want boars to significantly lose weight during the breeding season because, again, that affects fertility. So let's move on and talk about the breeding herd in more detail with regard to sows and gilts. I've got them separated out here a little bit. It's most important to think about from the gilt perspective is we're going to feed replacement gilts essentially exactly like a market hog, regardless of sex, all the way up until about 225 to 275 pounds. So somewhere in that range where the rest of the hogs will go to market, we will pull off only the replacement gilts that make the cut for a number of different metrics. We covered those in animal science if you were in there. And then begin to feed them a little bit differently. But we want full genetic expression on those replacement gilts. Then we're going to give them about 2 to 3 estrus cycles so that we get full ovulation potential. And this is going to be about 6 or 7 months of age or so forth. And after that, we're going to start to limit carbohydrate concentration in the diet. Pregnant gilts, we want to limit them to about 75 to 100 pounds weight gain during gestation. Otherwise, we begin to get farrowing problems and things of that nature. So we're going to add fiber, again, similar products, maybe an alfalfa meal, a soybean hulls, a cottonseed hulls, etc., in order to manage that weight gain. more effectively. Sows from pre-gestation time, so when they're not pregnant, again, we're going to very, very tightly monitor body condition score. From 225 pounds plus, again, similar to as those come out of that, those gilts come out of that market hog ration, we're going to restrict that diet to about 60 to 75% then of the finished ration. We still want to grow the frame, so we want to keep adequate protein concentration while we restrict the fat deposition. That's really how we're trying to manipulate the diet here. Sows that have already had a litter of piglets, we can breed them provided that they're healthy at the first estrus right after weaning. And as they get to end of gestation, and then through that weaning time, we want to increase the carbohydrate density. So the last 2 to 5 weeks of gestation, through that transitional farrowing time, and all the way up through weaning, we're going to really make sure that that ration is very carbohydrate dense, probably adding some fat and things of that nature that we'll talk later on. But essentially, it takes about a 12 to 14% crude protein diet and somewhere between 5,500 and 6,500 kcals of metabolizable energy. You might make note of a couple of those numbers because those will come in handy as we move along here. Increase dietary fiber at farrowing just a little bit in order to minimize constipation. Farrowing hogs are prone to that a little bit. The lactating sow, we ought to focus on her just a little bit more in more detail. Make sure feeding and consumption matches the need. So again, we're monitoring body condition changes. So we are probably going to need substantial energy and protein to support that milk production need. Typically, lactation is 2 to 4 times the amount of maintenance required. Just 2 to 4 times more energy than what they require for simple maintenance. So we have to really make sure that our ration is very energy dense. Other guidelines, about 13 to 16% crude protein. So the more the piglets that you have, the higher up on that spectrum, and I would venture a guess that most of the rations are on the high end of that spectrum. Very high energy density, very low fiber, just enough to keep them from being constipated. And so just to give you an idea how much they might eat, of course, we base that back like we did in Unit 3 on body weight. But just to kind of give you a guideline for lactating sows, they typically need about 4 to 5 pounds per head per day of base feed, and then a pound of feed for every piglet that they're nursing. So if they've got 12 baby pigs in the litter, they need 4 to 5 pounds a day of base feed, and then 12 baby pigs in the litter add 12 more pounds, so 16 or 17 pounds of feed is what they need to eat to support those that litter of baby pigs. You'll start to see when we talk about lactating sows, the introduction of fat in the diet to increase energy density. Because of the carbohydrate need for milk, it helps with piglet survival, it makes your litter weights heavier, and minimizes that sow weight loss. So you'll start to see a fairly significant inclusion rate of fat in the diet, somewhere in that 5 to 7% neighborhood, and you'll see that number probably repeated again here. As we talk about feeding the piglet now, colostrum intake is essential. We want to maximize that consumption within the first 72 hours of birth, primarily for energy support and especially immune transfer. Baby piglets also need supplemental iron injections for about the first 3 weeks because their iron need is much greater than the iron that's deposited in milk. And so that supplemental iron injection helps bridge that gap until about 3 weeks of age whenever they all catch up. Weaning time typically is about 21 days, so we get fast average daily gains. It used to be quite a bit older than that. And then in the last 2 decades, the industry has basically moved to a 21-day wean program. That creates lean meat, very high carcass quality, and extremely much better profitability. We want to make sure and maintain energy density and very closely monitor intake. While piglets are going to be in groups here, we need to be making sure to take weights of our piglets and weights of the feed and monitor that on a regular basis so we can have a pretty good estimate on what average intake is. So we may do some other things like pelleting of the diet, add sprayed whey onto the top of pellets in order to increase your carbohydrate density, maximize intake. This is the highest risk time for health for pigs. So we want to make sure and get them off on the right start. And that helps us conclude our slide here with making sure that we're managing the health and facilities in a very proper and intentional manner. That will make our rations perform at the optimal level. All right, so approaching the end of our first segment here, we got to finish up talking about the market hog. So from a protein perspective, after water, it's basically the highest influence on efficiency. And really, as we've mentioned before, amino acids are much more important than carbohydrates. And I've listed the key limiting amino acids here, and those proportions change a little bit with age. But typically, lysine is the first limiting amino acid. We want to think intentionally about carbohydrate density. So we want to optimize the carbohydrates that we feed, utilize fat as a way to increase energy density at appropriate times. And then use medications where necessary and as appropriate. Those will help increase average daily gain and help us treat and prevent disease intentionally. So now that you get to think about eating that delicious pork chop that's there, let's take a brief time out and I'll come back with the second segment.